I think they have a lot of space to grow, and I'm hoping that they grow as a show as they go forward, right? I'm hoping that they get better with each season and make this a better show. I hope they do an opposite Game of Thrones, right? We're talking about, we're like, this episode, and they,
All right, welcome everyone to another TV Club bonus episode where we will be reviewing the first season of The Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power. And today I'm joined by a fantastic panel of guests who will be exploring Middle-earth with me from the mountain depths of Khazad-dûm to the grand shores of Númenor. And first up is Djèlí Clark, making his second appearance on the show. Phenderson is the award-winning author of Ring Shout, A Master of Djinn, and more. He's also a Lord of the Rings mega fan and our wise resident Istar. So welcome back, good sir. How are you?
well, thank you for having me here.
Yeah,
wait
pleasure.
To talk rings and things.
Oh, yeah, rings and things. And also with us is Sara Carothers, making her fifth appearance on the show. She's one half of Fiction Fans and a lover of pugs, and the most Bilbo Baggins-like human to ever walk our Middle-earth. A pleasure as always, Sara. How is it going?
Hi, thank you for having me.
Happy to have you here as always. And last but not least, Mr. Biceps himself, our very own Balrog, Connor and Caplan. Also making his fifth appearance on sffaddictspod, and he's the author of Sword in the Street, and his soon-to-be-released book, The Fall Is All There Is out on November 7th. So congrats on that, buddy, and great to see you.
Thank you. Mr. Biceps' nickname is growing on me every time you say it.
Oh, it's permanent now.
Oh, I'm loving it. It's just a shot directly to the ego.
Hell yeah, man. All right, so full spoilers ahead. Just to kick this panel off, tell me, dear friends, what is your personal relationship with the Lord of the Rings franchise? So, Sara, I'll kick it to you first.
Okay, so my relationship with Lord of the Rings and with Tolkien started in '97 when my father gave me a copy of The Hobbit, and I absolutely refused to read it because he wanted me to read it so badly. And I don't think I actually picked it up until the Lord of the Rings movies came out, the Jackson movies. And I was just completely a big fan of them, and I wanted to read all Tolkien that I could. So I dove headfirst into the world of Tolkien and have not looked back since.
Your poor father, he had to suffer through what, like 4 years?
I feel so bad for him. I feel so bad for him because like he really wanted me to read The Hobbit. Like he was like, you're going to love it. Like, this is a great book. You know, you really need to read this book. And every time he told me that I should read it, I just dug my heels in because if you're telling me something, like if you're telling me to do something, no, I don't want to do it.
Yeah.
And then I regretted it because obviously it was fantastic and I loved it, but
it's okay. You came back.
I did come back, but I do feel for him.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like reverse psychology. Don't push it on them. Just let it happen naturally, or read it to them at bedtime. Be like, you don't have a choice. I'm just going to read these words.
That's what my dad did.
Listen. Yeah. Well, Connor, what about you? What was your relationship with the Lord of the Rings?
I think it started at like a very, very like 6 or 7, I think, with the 1977 Rankin Bass version of The Hobbit.
Nice.
Which was like, we watched that as a family a lot. Anytime, like, in retrospect, probably anytime my parents needed to keep us busy for a bit, or like an hour and a half. Yeah. And I remember both really liking it and being like really freaked out by parts of it, especially the stuff with the spiders. I think that was the only thing I knew. I didn't even know the Lord of the Rings existed until even while the Lord of the Rings movies were coming out. I was still in the single digit ages, so I did not really know what they were. And then eventually, my dad sat us down, I think when we were in 6th grade, and showed us the movies first. He made it into like a whole event, like just had a bunch of food and everything, sat down so that we could eat and watch it and everything. It was like a whole event, like a 3 day. He blocked out 3 days so we could watch them all. Like he kept having to pause to explain it all to us and get into all of the lore. And like, oh, they skipped this part as well. There's this thing that they didn't get into, and I think it wasn't until high school that I really, really got into it. When I read the books, and then I had a friend who was reading the Silmarillion, and then I think concurrently I also was getting into the Silmarillion, and we couldn't follow it, so we started taking notes, and then it started just to become like a reference point socially, where the two of us could sort of reference things in those books as like a reflection of like whatever we were dealing with socially, and no one else would be able to understand what we were saying. Like we'd just like be at lunch with other people just referencing Near Nodiad or something, or some shit that no one else understood. Like, yeah, no, great. I also have unnumbered tears with this situation. Like, and it just, I think it was like a foundational influence for me, because I was really getting into it around the same time I was getting into writing in general. And for a number of years, it was just the thing that I would look to for like, how do you make something that you really care about that much? And so just trying to figure out what made it work, and how even just Tolkien took all those passions and made it into a thing, was something I was really interested in ever since.
Yeah, that's very cool though. It's like your trajectory is kind of like absorbing passion in different forms. I love that your dad sat you down for like 3 days and be like, we're gonna watch this. I'm coaxing you with food, so just deal
literally.
Let me explain to you how they cut out Tom Bombadil or whatever the fuck else isn't in this movie. And then you kind of got into it from like a more, I don't know, self-driven academic perspective with your friend of like, let's like deconstruct this world, or like let's go through the Silmarillion and figure out like what the hell is going on here. Because that's really cool. And Phenderson, what about you? What's your relationship with the franchise?
I think, well, as I have a relationship similar in some ways to Connor, but different, because I'm the elder wizard here. And so I think I was about 7 or so as well, and introduced to it through the Rankin Bass films, which came on around used to come on like the day after Thanksgiving or something. And so
interesting.
My father would he really liked watching it, and we would just watch it together. So it was just a common thing that like every year we'd watch that. At the same time, they also had this, I remember this kid in my school had it was an illustration book from the Rankin Bass cartoon, and I was fascinated by the image of Smaug, and that's one time when I was just fascinated by anything dragons. And so seeing Smaug and everything, I was like, wow. And so I read The Hobbit sometime around then. I was really young, and I read it, and I don't know if I understood most of it. I mean, I was under 10. And so I read it all, and I was at the same time reading C.S. Lewis books, because I'd also gotten into Narnia, thanks also to a TV show. Right. And so I've been bought into that. And so I read The Hobbit. And then I think the most I knew about The Lord of the Rings was that there was also a weirdo cartoon, but kind of used people to like base the cartoon. I don't know if everybody knows this. And it's a, if there's a whip, there's a way type thing. So I knew a bit of The Lord of the Rings from that. But, that's just pieces. And so I think that's just most of Return to King even. And so I never fully understood it until I guess sometime in middle school. I went back and I read The Hobbit. And I think I got reintroduced to everything through there. And I kind of understood, I was at an older age to understand it a lot more than, reading it when I was 8 or whatever. And so I read that, and then I read the entire trilogy, and I was like, oh, and I was really into it. I mean, so much so that I think I did in seventh grade, I did a book report, and I created a poster. And I went back and I found that poster later in life. And what's a trip is that once the movies came out, it turned out I'd forgotten this poster was from The Two Towers. And so in my poster, I have like Merry and Pippin. I have Boromir, because remember in the books, Boromir dies in The Two Towers, right? So I have him, I have him there, like with the arrows in him. I imagined ants, and I don't know how I managed to do it. I said, how did I even figure this out? I have like walking trees, and I have like oliphants, and I was just amazed that I was thinking this time, because I was many, many years from ever seeing a movie, right? Mm-hmm. And so when the movies came out, when the movies were coming out, I was completely fast, because this was something that by now it's just been part of my life, and I never thought there'd be a movie. I remember seeing like the first images were like of the orcs, and I remember almost fainting because I was like, "That's an orc," and I made it a screensaver on my old, I don't know, my Windows 95 or something. I made it a screensaver, and I remember just being enthralled and seeing like I still remember the trailer of A Fellowship of the Ring. Right. And going to see that and then making other people go see it over and over again with me. Like I snuck to go see it at the beginning. We were all supposed to go as a group. And I was like, no way. I went to see like the midnight screening. Then I went to see it with the group. And then I must have seen Fellowship over and over again by getting different people to come in and just looking at their excitement, like when they saw the Balrog. I mean, when you read the book, you'd never imagined the Balrog if you hadn't seen the movie before. So it was always like, what does it look like? The Balrogs have wings. And then to actually see them do it. So it was just watching this thing come to life. So that was just an amazing moment. And so, yeah, I think I've always been into it. And actually, it was sometime in between that I read Silmarillion. So when I found that they were making a show, I was like, how are they going to do this? It's just a bunch of weird notes.
Yeah, exactly.
Not much there. There's not a lot of there. What are they going to do? And I was really worried that they would do what was done to The Hobbit, where you don't have much. So you say, what if I stretch this thing that should be a book into 3 gigantic movies that kind of get overbloated? And so I was really wondering how they were going to, even though there's a lot of time to talk about, how they're going to fill in all the gaps, to make it a story. Because it kind of reads just like you kind of just as this history. How do you make it a story? And so I've been interested. It's been interesting to watch them do this. It's gonna be interesting to see what they do going forward.
Yeah, for sure. And we'll touch on that in a minute, but I'll just pop in. I love that you both, Connor and Phenderson, started with the animated movie. I was similar to Sarah in that my grandma, did a much better job of like psychologically manipulating me into reading the book, The Hobbit, and I loved it. I was also reading it around the same time as I got into Narnia. So I was kind of like on this huge secondary world fantasy kick of like, things that were way beyond my comprehension in terms of, commentary on religion and morality and all these kind of things that Narnia and Lord of the Rings present. But I loved it so much. And Bilbo was my boy. I love Bilbo, which is why that was one of the few aspects of the Hobbit trilogy that I was like, okay, Martin Freeman, you're also my boy. So this is good. But everything else is pretty shit surrounding this. But I remember the very first VHS that I ever bought, with my own allowance money, was The Fellowship of the Ring. And I would have been 10 years old at that time. And I remember going to the store and my mom was going grocery shopping. And I just said, I'm going to go to the, electronics section. And I saw the VHS there. And then I run over to my mom and I'm like, I need to buy this because I saw I'd heard about the Lord of the Rings movies, but I hadn't ever seen a trailer or anything like that. I just read The Hobbit, was starting to get into the books. And I just saw that VHS slipcase of like the Fellowship and the, and like the Nazgul. And I was like, holy shit. And I remember my mom had to do a bunch of errands after that. And I sat in the car just literally reading and looking at that VHS slipcase for like an hour. And then I got home and I put it in and I watched the whole movie. The next year, Two Towers came out. My brother, who's 7 years older than me, so he was a teenager at the time. I was like 11. And he took me to see the midnight premiere of the Two Towers without telling my parents. And my parents were so pissed off, but I was so happy about it. It's like we got home. My parents were like, where the hell did you take him? And it's like, oh, I took him to see the Lord of the Rings. So for me, it's like the movies were kind of this like natural trajectory of me reading The Hobbit, becoming enamored with the world, starting to get into Lord of the Rings, and then reading them and watching the movies kind of concurrently. So it was really easy for me to, like you say, Phenderson, like this imagery thing of, I wonder what the Balrog looks like, or I wonder what the Ents look like. And all those things were happening at the same time. So I was reading them and using my own visual imagination, but at the same time seeing the movie. So it was really cool. I have not ever read Unfinished Tales or Silmarillion or gone that deep into it, because I think I started the Silmarillion and I was like, yeah, this is too dense. And I didn't have anyone to share it with like you, Connor. So I just kind of gave up on it. But the Lord of the Rings has always existed in my imagination as this really, really powerful franchise, you know? And it kind of makes sense to me why it has accrued such like high status within like the fantasy and even like pop culture, broader pop culture kind of worlds. And I was curious what all of you thought about that, like the way that the Lord of the Rings has kind of like transcended so many other things in fantasy. Whoever wants to jump in.
I mean, I guess for me, it's strange because, you know, because again, I'm coming from a point where when I was reading this stuff, there were no movies. And so it's kind of like being a Marvel comic reader before the MCU, right? And so now everybody's into Marvel comics. People who you would never think you're into Marvel, okay. So that's cool. You know, and so there was a point, I think there's a point where I knew this stuff and like a few other people knew it. It was almost like code. Nobody knew what the heck I was talking about. I remember when I read one of the first things I did, I remember when I read Lord of the Rings was I memorized the 3 rings for the Elven Kings thing. I was memorizing the preamble to the Constitution like I should have been in class, or memorizing whatever Shakespeare thing. I was like, I'm memorizing this. And so I've known that, like, that's probably one of the poems I've known my whole life that I can just quote that perfectly off the top of my head. It was just like something that I knew and a few people knew. And so it was interesting to see when the film came out, to see it bring in all of these new people, right? And so now they've had 3 movies, then you have the Hobbit movies, you know, come in. And it's like, it's a different world now. Now, like, so Rings of Power is coming out, and it just has a reception that's really different, I think, even than when the first Fellowship was coming out. When for the readers, it was a big deal. But for a lot of people who had never read it, it was just, you know, it was an interesting movie and they might go drag along. But I think having the Jackson franchise has just changed the entire Tolkien universe to me, and the amount of people it brings in, and creating this entire fan culture that's so very different from when it was just a few geeky dudes reading a few books, right? Freaky guys and girls are like, oh yeah, we know this stuff. And like the 3 of us, we have, like you said, John, we have this little joke, nobody knows the heck we're talking about. Yeah. Now that's different. It's everywhere. Everyone knows what you mean.
Yeah. It's like transcended into pop culture phenomenon. Yeah. Sarah?
I mean, I think it's always been a little bit of a phenomenon, not quite to the extent that it is now, obviously, but like it was wildly successful for Tolkien, like during his lifetime. And I think it's been this kind of foundational text for a lot of the fantasy genre. So in that respect, like, I think that it has had just a huge influence on pop culture and fantasy and readers everywhere, really.
Yeah. Connor, thoughts?
I like the comparison to reading Marvel before there was the MCU, because I think I grew up after the movies were already out there and everything. I think that might be why I gravitated towards the Silmarillion the way I did, because I wanted that sort of thing where it's like I wanted to have that thing where no one else knew what the fuck I was talking about for a while. I think it's one of those things where I think it's easy for me to take a lot of Lord of the Rings influence for granted, because I like having grown up both after the original books came out, after most of its influence on genre had sort of like settled, and then I was growing up around the time like people were doing like the grimdark reactions to Tolkien. You were getting quotes like "This isn't your daddy's fantasy" kind of shit. Like that was the kind of books that were being published while I was growing up. Like I think the sort of main changes around Tolkien pop culture I was seeing was like around movies usually, because I think similar to how Tolkien publishing the trilogy changed fantasy, I think Jackson changed film, like in general, like the way that movies are made. Like no one made people made sequels before those movies, but like they were like a sort of low art kind of a thing usually, and usually they didn't do pretty well. And this sort of proved franchises were possible, and it's like usually whenever there's some sort of adaptation of Tolkien, I think there's some sort of expectation that in some way it's going to sort of set some kind of precedent for good or ill.
Yeah, I agree. Well, Connor, what were your thoughts when Amazon announced that they were making a show about the Lord of the Rings, and especially the fact that it was based on, ages past, the Second Age, and mostly like what I would call Silmarillion footnote type historical stuff?
I was tense about it even from the jump. I think at the best I was hoping for is like, well, I sure hope they either go Beren and Luthien or Children of Hurin, because those are the sort of like easiest sort of like foothold that have like a cohesive narrative around them.
Yeah.
I was hoping they go for some sort of anthology kind of show where each season is some kind of microcosm of something that happens in there.
Like the Sandman.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah. That would have been really nice. No, I never really sort of started not necessarily have high hopes for it. Even just from the way that Jeff Bezos would talk about it, it seemed very different from the way that Peter Jackson would talk about it, where like we watch like the behind the scenes stuff for the Peter Jackson trilogy and everything. Like everyone involved is talking about how it's just such this labor of love, and they all have this deep connection to it. And even the people who never read Tolkien beforehand are like going back, and like you have Ian McKellen being like, "Oh, I was reading this section of this scene that where Gandalf is doing this thing, and I was thinking I should do this thing." And it's everyone absolutely adores what they're working with, and then seeing the way that I think a lot of the Amazon people were sort of talking about it, it felt less like love and more like ownership. And that already sort of set me on edge before the show was even out. There were quotes like, "Are we bold enough to create to write the book that Tolkien never wrote?" And like I saw that quote and already I was like, okay, well, that certainly sets my expectations.
I'd never heard that quote. Shit, man. Yeah, it's very. I mean, Bezos already. It's like his sort of the ownership thing is really big in the sense of like who has rights to this material, and that kind of stuff. But I'd never heard that quote, and that's a fucking bold thing to say.
Yeah, it was. Like, I think one of the showrunners said that in an interview.
Would we dare? Would we dare do it? Phenderson, what about you? What did you think when you first heard about this project?
I was early. First of all, I didn't know what they were going to do. And so I was like, I mean, when they said they were going to go back and do before, I was like, oh my God, are we going to see Balrogs riding on the backs of dragons? Because that would paint into a puddle on the floor and it'll be over. Or I'd be running around the theater, whatever, 15 times. So I didn't know what to think, and I didn't know where they would start. I remember I was wondering, and I said, "Oh, we're gonna get to see Númenor slide into the sea. I'll take that as a consolation." And so I was I immediately had high hopes once I saw the trailer. I didn't know what to think beforehand. This is Amazon. We've already had our Wheel of Time discussion. Yeah. And and we talked about the highs. We talked about the highs and the lows of the Wheel of Time, mainly costuming with the Wheel of Time. So I didn't know what this would look like. And as soon as I saw the trailers, I was like, okay, I'm relieved. It looks like visually, this looks like it's gonna work. All right. And so then I was just excited. Then we talk about later the push for diversity, the thing that I've been talking about in Tolkien world forever. I had run a whole blog called the Disgruntled Haradrim, which is basically about the issues of lack of diversity or what have you. And so I saw that and everything else. And so I was instantly intrigued about what would come. And so, yeah, I think I had Connor's like, are they going to mess it up? But I was much more, I was like, I'm just ready to see it. I'm ready to see what they're going to do.
Yeah, just take what comes kind of thing.
Yep.
Yeah.
I'm happy, by the way, I would say I'm happy. We live in this golden age of this. When I was growing up, again, as the old person here, the only fantasy we had was Conan. You had to watch the Conan movies. Those were pretty brutal. Mostly hardcore sword and sorcery. You had the never-ending story. That was about it. And you had Tom Cruise in Legend. right?
That's
And if you were a
man.
fantasy head, that's about it.
Yeah.
As a kid, you didn't have anything else, right? And so, like, you know, it kind of says Tolkien, like, and I think Sarah said Tolkien just changed the very nature of filmmaking, right? It's like, oh, it's okay to make films about fantasy. It's okay to do that, right? You can have these things and people will come. So, yeah, so I was just happy to see it.
It's okay for all of us to embrace our nerdiness, to be like, yeah, I love fantasy, I love Marvel, whatever, and people are like, oh, me too, and it's way more a common thing now. Sarah, what about you? What did you think when you heard about this show?
I try to keep an open mind about shows like before I've seen any. If it's an author or like a franchise that I'm interested in, like I try to keep an open mind. So I was cautiously optimistic. When I saw the trailer, I thought it looked very pretty. Like when they announced the casting, I was like, great, like you've got some great actors here. I'm thrilled about that. Ultimately, I ended up not enjoying the show. More power to everyone who enjoys it, but it wasn't for me personally. But I was cautiously optimistic before I started watching it.
Mm-hmm. I was the same way. It's kind of like, this is something that is so near and dear to my heart that, you know, I was very hesitant, saw the trailer, was like, okay, you know, a lot of people were complaining that Amazon, it's like everything Amazon does in terms of fantasy feels a bit clean, as opposed to, you know, Game of Thrones or, you know, House of the Dragon, where things are a lot dirtier, a lot more gritty.
I mean, I like being able to see what's on my screen, so I don't mind that.
Yeah. Comment on visual perception of a scene. Don't make it so fucking dark, people. But I thought it was really.
When they say grimdark, this isn't what they mean.
This ain't your daddy's fantasy show. I love like the look of it. The look was really cool, even though some people were complaining about that kind of clean aspect to it. And we'll get into first impressions. And for me, it's like that cautious optimism led to, you know, me deciding early on, like, I'm going to finish this. There's only 8 episodes. I don't really care how it is. I just want to see what it looks like from beginning to end. And for me, it felt a lot more like, it's kind of this like more style than substance kind of thing. There was a lot of visual style to it. There was a lot of really good direction in terms of the way that scenes were shot or the way that they incorporated VFX with, you know, hand-built sets and hand-built armor and costumes and horses and all this kind of stuff. But when it comes down to it, it's like there was a lot, like the dialogue fell flat for me so often that it kind of like pulled me out of a lot of scenes. There was a lot of pacing issues that I felt really took away from the investment that I had in certain characters, where it's like, okay, I don't want to see any more of these fucking Harfoots for a minute. And then it just lingered for like 3-4 minutes more. Then they start singing songs. And I'm like, oh, come on, man. This is why Tom Bombadil was cut from the Lord of the Rings trilogy. And then, you know, seeing like characters that I was really wanting to see more of, like Elrond and the Dwarves, they were just cut out for an entire episode. So it felt really disjointed from like a structural level for me. But visually, in terms of the way that they're kind of like, I don't know, just shit mixing all this different stuff from Tolkien lore into this redefined timeline kind of thing. That for me, it's like, okay, the conceptually was all really cool. I want to see the fall of Númenor. I love the way that they handled certain aspects of Númenor. I'm really interested in the elves. I love the dwarves and the Southlanders, give or take, whatever. You know, they're, you know, the former residents of Mordor kind of deal. Harfoots, I could get rid of them. But overall, there was just a bit too much, you know, structural and pacing issues that it kept pulling me out of my investment in it, despite the fact that I was really loving certain set pieces. The combat was fantastic and the fight scenes. There was a lot of fan service in certain ways that I was like, okay, that's like a cute nod to earlier stuff in the books or in the Peter Jackson trilogy. But overall, it's like so many aspects being so disjointed for me left me feeling very mixed about the whole thing. I didn't hate it. but I didn't love it either. Phenderson, do you want to get in with some of your first impressions?
So, it was so I started off watching it. I liked it immediately. I like the idea of, I like that. I think it was the first episode with Galadriel. First of all, I like battle hardened Galadriel. I was completely here for that.
Yeah.
I like watching these elves going off in the snow and fighting and hunting down. I was really interested in that. I didn't mind the Harfoots. They could have used a bit better hygiene, I thought. Often
get those leaves out of your
watching
hair,
them crunch snails down did not help me eat my own food while I was watching it. They were an interesting addition. The whole deal with the stranger. I did see, there was a times that was drawn out. But it's funny when you say that there were these disjointed in pacing, and I've heard this before. The show had a slow burn to it. And I don't know if part of this was they were trying to capture a bit of Tolkien the writer, but trying to transmute that to the medium of visual medium. And I don't know if that works. Like you said, that's why Tom Bombadil is not in there, right? And why certain things should be cut out. And so I think one of the things that helps, of course, is that this isn't a movie that I have to sit through, that I can come each week. And so I was able to come back each week. And I don't think it was my favorite show. Like, if I was to rank this in the Tolkien verse of things, right, I'd still go with the first 3 films, and then this would get second because The Hobbit I just don't like talking about The Hobbit.
Peter Jackson didn't either. So.
I don't know what he was just like, I just need to check. I told him I'd finish this thing. Let's just do it. Yeah. Like, that was just really bad in many different ways. So, I put this after, but I think everybody said I came in cautiously optimistic, but also excited because I wanted to see this. And I think there were some episodes, like, certain things happened I could forget. It has so many different moving parts, for one, that I could tell it was going to be hard for them to put this all into 8 episodes, and it cost so much. Like, I don't think they needed an extra episode, like we were saying, like with Wheel of Time, like you needed one more episode. I think that all the episodes they needed here. I think there were some characters that got on my nerves, like that kid, Theo. You're like, you are the absolute worst. Are you Sauron? God.
That would have been an ultimate twist. Yeah.
But I thought some things were done great. Like, there were just some of the great scenes, like when he first encounters an orc. And what I never liked about Peter Jackson's orc, I was like, they're very easily killed. like one person can kill like 10 orcs. So I was like, why did anybody think you were a threat? And like, we got to see like, oh, an orc is a threat, even though, yes, he ends up getting killed by a mom and her kid. It's still, he's threatening, he's frightening. Like, I am an orc, like I'm an actual danger. And I thought, I was really happy. I thought it was a good job there. And, this was just a different type of story, I think. It like, I think somebody had said it tries to recreate a bit of the battles of Helm's Deep, but this wasn't a big battle story. This wasn't like Tolkien movie where there's going to be this big battle at the end. It was just, it's a much more slower burn, trying to get through these different plots so that we land. It ends where I thought it needed to end, right? Perhaps it could have been done in a shorter frame, but it needed to end where we got to see Morder get created and we got to see some rings get created, even though if it's, like you said, it's different from the books. They've inverted when the rings get created and all that. And then we get the reveal of who is Saruman, right? I mean, Saruman, who is Sauron? And so, I came away, I don't have a rating to give. I would give it, like a B. I'm a professor, so I'm gonna give it grade. I give it like a B something, somewhere along the B scale, maybe just a plain B. I mean, I'm definitely gonna show up next time. It's not one of those shows where I was like, yeah, I'm so out of it. Like, you're not gonna get me the next time. I'll just wait. I'm definitely want to see where they're going from here. I thought the show caught up with itself. I should put it that way. If anything, I think the last few episodes, kind of with the formation of war, I thought the show caught up with where it needed to be. And could they have gotten there a bit cleaner without some of the pacing issues and the time to slow us down? Perhaps. I don't know. I guess it's what you get when you get $1 billion.
Yeah, maybe just put a little bit more money into writing as opposed to
script writing. I think they're hiring writers. They hire a writing room. I figure they know what they're doing now.
Yeah. And Sarah, you mentioned your initial thoughts earlier, but do you want to expand a little bit?
Yeah, so I was really disappointed with it. It felt to me like they were just doing scenes because they looked cool and that they hadn't given any deeper thought into how it fit with the story that Tolkien wanted to tell. And like they made a lot of changes, which I understand you have to make changes in an adaptation. Like that's just how adapting something works. But I want to feel like I understand why you made those changes and where you're going with them. And for a lot of the time, I didn't. Like, with one exception, they condensed the timeline. That makes total sense. Like, I understand that. Like, you can't have a different human cast every season, like to go through 1,000 years or whatever. Like that's just silly. No one's going to be invested if the characters don't last. So like something like that makes sense to me. I understand it. I think it works really well for the medium, but a lot of their other changes just didn't, I don't know, they didn't resonate with me. Like they didn't work for me. It was a very pretty show. I liked the score. I thought Bear McCreary did a great job. I thought the casting in general was really good, with maybe the exception of Gil-galad and Celebrimbor. Like they didn't look like elves to me. They just looked like people with pointy ears. No offense to Charles Edwards. I love him to death. He's a great actor, but like he was not. None of the elves looked ethereal, or at least those elves didn't look ethereal. And I wanted them to look a little more ethereal.
Yeah. The most ethereal looking elves were the ones that were sent on the boat to Valinor. It's like, you guys, I mean, it could have been just like the immense, the
ethereal elves went first. They were the first to go.
Yeah, and then leave all these old farts over in Middle Earth. They can stay there.
and like, what was Galadriel thinking, that she was just going to swim back?
Yeah, I'm like, girl, you got some stamina. Holy
Literally.
Shit.
I gotta say, I'll be the person here. I'm kind of over Peter Jackson's ethereal elves. When I watch the movies and I hear that silly song come in, I was like, okay, yeah, the elves are showing up with their weirdo wimpy flags. They're gonna show up. I get the point. I get the Tolkien makes them, they're like above and they're like actually different from people. I get it. They're like the first creed and so forth. But going back, I watched some of the old Tolkien movies compared to this one. It's interesting how some things stand up. But it's kind of like going back and watching old Star Trek and everything's a little too Pollyanna-ish, compared to new stuff. And I kind of got annoyed with whenever the elves show people, elves. I was like, okay, I get it.
Yeah, I didn't need quite that level.
I think I actually liked that these elves were, like, these were folks who'd been in a battle. They had like fought things, right? They can still do some, they can probably still grab onto a horse and walk on snow and not fall through like our friend Legolas and so forth. They can swim back, I guess, from across the way.
Thousands of
kilometers. But actually, like that they weren't,
I just wanted them
so unapproachable in some ways that every time they showed up, like leaves fell.
I just wanted them to be like a little prettier. I mean, like Galadriel was great, Arondir was great, but they weren't pointy enough.
I think aesthetically, it wasn't necessarily that I needed them to be especially like ethereal. I just didn't want to see. I didn't want them to seem like the kind of, like, you could turn an aisle in Lowe's and just bump into this guy,
Yeah.
Like, you're just gonna find him in just any random hardware store. It's just like, hey, can you help me find like the screwdriver or something? Like, fucking, what are we doing? Like, can you at least just sort of like fucking guss him up a little bit? Come on, like.
I would love to see like an elf run hardware store in Middle Earth. Come in. Yeah. It's like, what do you want? It's like, I need the most ethereal fucking screwdriver you have. I'm building a tower to make a forge to build rings. Come on, man.
I need Celebrimbor going down to the fantasy Lowe's so that he can get the materials he needs to build the rings. Oh
my god. It's like, yeah, I'm gonna hit up like, what is it, like Linden Depot or something like that. Go check out what
Ye Old Home Depot.
Ye Old Linden Depot. Connor, give your first impressions about
I need to couch something first because I feel like a lot of my complaints are on the surface at least going to make me sound like someone who just deserves to be wedgied to death. Like a lot of my complaints are gonna sound like the kind of Star Wars fan is like, in the extended universe, like it's gonna sound not so great. But I feel like I'm with Sarah on a lot of the changes being like not so good. Like it's not that it's not the changes in and of themselves that bug me as much as it's like, as an example, like in the intro, that you have the shot of all the ships sailing for Middle Earth. And I remember sitting there like, well, how'd you get those ships, Galadriel? Pretty sure it's a foundational sort of thing. You're just going to skip over that? What are we doing? How are we going to rectify this? This is a very important event you're just not going to show.
I mean, to be fair, I don't think they had the rights to the kinslaying.
Oh yeah, like that's one of the things where it's like, I wouldn't have minded if they just skipped over that, but it seemed like the way they papered over that felt fairly abstract and made it much more difficult to get a firm hold on what the stakes of any of this was, or like why any of the, because they wanted to keep a lot of the consequences of the first kinslaying and everything without actually including it, so they had to like sort of paper over the cracks, and I think that left a lot of abstractness with a lot of the stakes and the ability to world build. I just, a lot of the changes could have worked in a show that seemed that was more devoted to following through the logical implications of the changes they were making, but it felt a lot of the times like they wanted to have their cake and eat it too. Like they wanted to slice and dice up the source material, but at the same time they wanted to show you a lot, to make references to the original, and have you just sort of make several impressed faces and everything and be awed by everything. And I think some of the times that felt a little bit disjointed. Mm-hmm. I got progressively angrier watching this because I don't know if you've seen some of the tweets about my hangups with the ending, but oh man, I'm trying to figure out how to put it. I don't know if I can necessarily like, I'm not an expert on a lot of these things, but it seemed to be touting itself as a very sort of progressive fantasy show, and for all that hype, I think there were a lot of sort of missteps that left a bit of a bad taste in my mouth, especially when it comes to the writing with Galadriel. Really.
Well, Connor, on that note, we'll save the ending for later.
Yeah.
There's one point that I wanted to comment on before we get into Galadriel. I like that you mentioned like they wanted to have their cake and eat it too. For me, it was like they're in this weird middle ground where they wanted to kind of cater towards a more like faithful adaptation of source material that they didn't directly have rights to, but at the same time, it's like they wanted to just kind of go off the walls a little bit in their own direction. Like you mentioned earlier, them saying like, is this the book that Tolkien himself never would have written?
Yeah, literally.
It's like, I think they should have gone farther in either direction. It's like either go more faithful or go more outright like, fuck it, off the rails, let's do our own thing, loose as possible kind of path. So it's like they had this weird middle ground that for me felt a little bit like inconsistent in terms of what they were pulling from, but also what they wanted to personally tell as like creative individuals coming together to make this show.
Yeah, it was like if you remember that iRobot movies with like Will Smith and everything in the early 2000s. It was like if they did that, but then like in the middle of all of that stuff, you were also getting like they were trying to cram in elements from like the short stories in there and everything, and trying to satisfy like the audience of people who would have wanted to see the short stories from that book, but also want to tell this, they also want to tell the story of a robot uprising kind of a thing. And it's like, there are times where that just doesn't quite mesh, at least for me. It didn't mesh for me, at least.
Yeah, that's fair. Well, let's get into, I kind of want to approach this based on like the 4 main narrative threads in terms of how we can kind of break apart this show. So we can also comment on locations and characters as they come up. Connor, you mentioned Galadriel, and Phenderson, you mentioned the prologue sort of sequence with our badass elves hunting Sauron. So let's get some commentary on Galadriel, if that prologue setup worked for you, what you thought about her as a character, and then also Sarah, you mentioned the elves as well. How she ties into the portrayal of the elves and Elrond coming into play, as well as Linden as a location. Sarah, do you want to go first?
Sure. I mean, I was very frustrated by Galadriel. I liked seeing her younger. I liked seeing her like warrior side.
Mm-hmm.
That was cool. But her decisions to me felt really inconsistent. And I had an issue with her just jumping off into the water, because what are you even doing, Galadriel? But also, like, she's looking for Sauron.
Dagger. She got her dagger. It doesn't matter.
Yeah, if she has the dagger, it's fine. But like, she's looking for Sauron, supposedly. But we don't really, at least I didn't feel like that was really a major motivator for a lot of the time for her, because here she is sitting in Númenor, like, just saying, we're going to go and make Halbrand king. How does that fit in with what your like goal is, with the driving force that has been driving you for the last however many centuries? Like, that it seemed to me really inconsistent that she would just suddenly not care about finding Sauron to go help this man that she's met for all of like 3 minutes.
But could that have been Halbrand's potential sway over Galadriel?
I mean, maybe, but if that was what they were going for, they didn't like do a good enough job of making that evident. And yeah, so I found that frustrating. I also felt that, like, if we're trying to look for Sauron, she really, like I said, she really doesn't spend that much time actually looking for him.
True. Other than the prologue.
Yeah, other than the prologue. And like, obviously we as a viewer know that he's already a cast member.
Mm.
And I did think it was by episode 4, I was pretty sure that it was Halbrand. So I think they did a good job of like leaving little breadcrumbs for people who have read the Silmarillion. I did like that, but yeah, overall, she just frustrated me.
Well, Phenderson, what about you? Did Galadriel frustrate you? You mentioned that you liked her as a warrior.
Yeah, I actually like this Galadriel character. I mean, I like Cate Blanchett's old Galadriel character, the slow talking elves and all this. And
all the glowing,
but I actually like this Galadriel, and seeing her as a warrior, seeing her obsession, right? That she is, I like this Galadriel that is flawed. Like, I think some of the choices she makes are that of a flawed, complicated, imperfect character, right? She is obsessed, so obsessed that I love the part, when Adar first tells her, like, maybe you're the dark elf here, right? That she's literally talking about committing genocide. I like that they bring up that point, like, yes, you guys, Tolkien's work's all about orc genocide. Literally happens at the end of everything. But yeah, I like that, she's this character that is driven and obsessed. And I think they're trying to play off in a sense in the way that Sauron himself, right, is also this driven figure, and that she has some of this in her. And it helps really bring up, like, I think later on, with when she's tempted or so forth, like we saw later on The Lord of the Rings, that she has this problem that it's like she's a character suffering from PTSD, we recall today, right? She's been in this terrible war, her brother's killed, and now she's obsessed to the point where the other elves are like, yo, Galadriel, you gotta take it easy. You're like, even like,
go take a vacation to heaven,
basically, the elf heaven. She's like, nope, I'm gonna stay in here, right? Like, she can't let it go. It just burns her up. And so, like, her decisions and how she ends up falling for the corruption in some ways and getting into that is part of the fact that she's this imperfect, flawed character, this soldier that can't let the war go, right? That can't let things go, even though she's right. She's not wrong, right? Sauron is out there. The danger's still there. Other folks can't see it. But I think it's turned her in many ways. And it's made her far from this innocent character. So when she was a child, so it made her this person who makes these terrible decisions at times, even to the point at the end where, she want to go into it, but she makes these decisions where I'm just going to I'm just going to hold off on the things that I've done, that I've contributed to all of this, which is why I figure, by the way, she doesn't take a big role in fighting in The Lord of the Rings, because they're like, yeah, Galadriel, you just sit this one out. You don't have great decision-making skills when it comes to these things.
You're too
susceptible. You have a lot of problems going on. Just let us handle this. Just stay away from these things. Yeah.
Is Lothlorien essentially like Galadriel's form of therapy? Just go figure your shit out.
Basically, it's like,
Lothlorien is Galadriel's own personal
I
pillow
think
fort.
she is that kind of character. Yeah, it's a very imperfect character.
Your golden leaved pillow fort. Yeah. I'm kind of in the middle of you and Sarah, where it's like, I like Galadriel. I like that she has these motivations. There's one shot where she's like piling up the helmets of the fallen soldiers, which I thought was like, that's a very good visual metaphor for like the burden and the weight of what she's feeling in her hunt for Sauron and the way that all these elves have died and that kind of stuff. But at the same time, Sarah, I agree with you that there's a lot of inconsistency in terms of like the way that she deviates and is distracted by things. It's like, girl, you just need to focus on shit, you know? Because it's like, I love how she ended up in Númenor. I thought that was like despite the fact that she jumped off a boat in the middle of the ocean, is a cool way of kind of like incorporating Númenor into the equation. And we got a lot of Númenorian history. And, you know, we get to see Elendil and Isildur, even though Isildur is just like a little butthead, you know, just like be more responsible, dude. But I loved like the architecture of Númenor, like the clothing and all that kind of stuff felt really, really interesting to me. And I love how everyone reacted to an elf being there. But then I feel like they just kind of like forgot about the fact that an elf was there, and they're like, brouhaha, let's go to Middle Earth and go help these Southlanders kind of thing. And it's like, okay, you know, Galadriel, you're very good at persuading people, but you're not good at persuading yourself. Like, what is a good goal? Because it's like, there are certain decisions that she makes where she just, you know, I wanted to see more Sauron. Like, I wanted that to be a question that was more frequently addressed, as opposed to something that was like really heavily established in the beginning, and then she just kind of gets drawn along into this like, I got to get back to Middle Earth, but I'm not really talking that much about Sauron, you know, even if it's like to herself, you know, just like tell yourself that it's all about Sauron, and I'll agree with you. But she's just like, yeah, we got to make Halbrand king, and then they get to Middle Earth, and still there's not like as much weight to this quest. Like, I feel like that could have been Galadriel's, I feel like it could have been a much stronger through line throughout the season for her to be more persistent. And she shows this ruthlessness throughout the season, which I think is really cool and kind of fits into her more warrior-esque nature. But she could have, like, I would have loved it if she was even more ruthless, in the sense of like, I need to find Sauron regardless of who I, you know, hurt or kill or like leave behind in my righteous path kind of thing. So for me, it's like, she was really cool the way they established her, but I felt like there wasn't enough consistency to how her character continued to progress, despite the fact that there were some really cool moments with her. There were some really cool sort of interactions with other characters, and we'll get to what Phenderson alluded to earlier, but like her just being like, oh shit, yeah, I brought Sauron into Middle Earth. It was me. Oops. kind of thing.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, yeah, but you're gonna have to deal with the consequences of that. It's like, I want to see more ruthlessness, but I also want to see like more consequence to what she's been doing, because yeah, it's like, she is very flawed, and I like that she's flawed, but at the same time, I feel like they just kind of misstepped along the way, as you mentioned, Sarah, in terms of like, yeah, you just don't feel very consistent in a lot of the
I
things
just like, there is no follow through for her on this one big question, and I would have liked to see that addressed more than it was.
Yeah. And Connor, what about you? What did you think of our dear elf?
I initially was not a fan of the whole thing where she jumps out of the ship and swims all the way back. But by the time we got to the end, I think that became like the one thing I sort of didn't mind about it, because it felt like the one point in the show where she actually makes a decision. I think that was one of my biggest sort of hangups with the way they wrote Galadriel. Is it never really felt like she had a lot of agency in her own story, her own quest to find Sauron and everything. She spends a lot of the show just sort of like being shuffled from place to place, and it feels like most of the key events in her narrative were dictated by other people around her. And she was like, she was part of it, but it never felt like she was made any of the key decisions, or any of her choices were particularly reflective of any character or journey that she seemed to be going on. And so a lot of the time it felt almost reminiscent of like that 90s approach to writing like female characters, where it's like she doesn't necessarily do a lot, but she's got a sword. So hashtag feminism or something like that. That was the vibe I got from it. Where it's like, I mean, I like what they were attempting to do with like making a flawed character who's like this sort of like badass warrior and everything. But I think a lot of the time she never really got a chance to basically do anything interesting or make any interesting decisions. And I think especially by the end, she just kind of looks incompetent by the end of it. Just that was one of the way the ending retroactively influences the rest of her arc just makes her look like, at least to me, seemed to make her look like completely incompetent in a way that sort of goes against the promises made by the opening. Like the opening sets her up as this specific kind of character and everything, who's driven to find Sauron, but then she's not even able to find him when he's been in front of her for the past 7 hours we've been watching. It's like, so how bad are you looking for Sauron if you haven't been able to find him for the past like fucking week you've been with him? It's just sort of like her character felt very sort of really flat for me, in a way that sort of really irked me.
Yeah, that's totally fair. And that's the complete opposite of how I felt about Elrond, who's this character who, like, I love Hugo Weaving in the Lord of the Rings movies as Elrond, and I felt like he had like a nice depth to him here, where he's very conflicted about like his role as sort of like an elven politician. But at the same time, it's like he has to be the messenger for Gil-galad and Celebrimbor, going to Khazad-dûm and using his past relationship with the dwarves. The dwarf, like the representation of Khazad-dûm and the way that the dwarves were done in terms of makeup and costuming and everything like that was, for me, really, really awesome. And I loved the way that they kind of expanded on this like elf dwarf relationship that was so prominent in the books with Gimli and Legolas, and then was really heavily present in the Lord of the Rings movies between Legolas and Gimli. I thought they did a nice job here where it didn't feel like the same thing. They weren't treading exactly the same territory. And there was a lot of complexity there in terms of representing Elrond as someone who's like conflicted when it comes to his race and his culture versus his friendships and his promises that he wants to keep to people like Durin. So I wanted to get all of your takes on Elrond as sort of like an elvish opposite to Galadriel, because he's more peaceful and very purposeful and conscious about the decisions that he's making, even though he knows a lot of the times like it could hurt my people, or I could hurt Durin's feelings and ruin my friendship with him, even though I didn't go to his wedding or see his kids being born, you piece of shit, but it's fine. Phenderson, do you want to get in on this?
Yeah, I mean, I really like the Elrond character. I think he's different from Galadriel in the fact that, he doesn't need therapy.
That's why I got Rivendell and all my waterfalls.
Yeah, he's mostly sitting around reading books and stuff, and he hasn't seen you haven't seen what I've seen, right? And so yeah, he gets to be this different person. And I do like what they did with him. I really like the relationship between him and Durin is probably one of the best things I think the series has between those two. To talk about the relationship between the dwarves and elves, which are always there, and I think the way they do this one, where they're friends, they should have a spinoff just with those two going out having adventures.
Like a buddy
I would
cop,
watch that.
a buddy
Oh,
cop
yeah.
movie. Yeah.
If there was a show
amazing.
just about them, I would. That was definitely one of the stronger elements. I would definitely tune in for that.
They have I think they do a good relationship there with them, and then bringing them to the story and how he plays out in this role. And I actually am intrigued to because at the end he knows what Galadriel knows, and the fact that he decides to keep it secret, but he knows what it is. I like to see how their friendship is obviously going to sour on this and fracture, and yet he's not going to he's not going to snitch out. He probably has a ton of questions on what's going on here. Why aren't you speaking? And those are things I think they'll have to answer, and we'll have to see in the coming seasons, as well as what happens between him and Durin, since we know that Durin is going to mine that mithril against his father's wishes. And it turns out his father isn't wrong. A whole lot of people here aren't wrong in the warnings we're giving, but hindsight is 20/20. They don't know what we know. And so it's going to be interesting to see how he moves forward, both in his relationship with the dwarves, because he's like our link to the dwarves, as well as his relationship with the elves and Galadriel and the others.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that it's like, just in hindsight, we have like the Lord of the Rings, the mention of Moria. It's like they dug too greedy, they dug too deep, and it's just like, yeah, no shit, man. Balrogs, buddy.
I just want to say, it turns out they weren't just greedy. I mean, I guess we shouldn't have been listening to Saruman anyway as the author on that which actually happened. It turns out Durin does it for a completely different reason, which is fascinating, right? He does it in part because he wants to help save his friend in the elves, right? So here is this great mistake that, yes, we all dug too greedily and too deep, when it's like, okay, it wasn't just greed. Even if that's a part of it, I did it for this larger reason. And so I thought that was a good thing that was interesting to see in there.
Yeah.
And whether people like it or not, the dwarves to be greedy. And we can talk about, there were some problems. There were always some problems.
Yeah, I was going to say.
I want to go into it with. Tolkien, you're on some thin ice there with your greedy dwarves. It was good to see that there was a difference here in why they did it, rather than the dwarves we're just greedy and we're just into the mithril, that it had a larger purpose.
Yeah, and Disa as well, the wife of Durin, was a really cool character, and one of those additions where I was like, yeah, who gives a shit about what all the people are saying online? It's like, you can't have a black dwarf. It's like, shut up.
Why is that where you draw the line?
Exactly. But she was I love this three-way relationship between Disa and Elrond and Durin, where it's like adding so much emotional complexity to the situation, where, like you say, it's like too greedily, too deep, but that is given a lot more nuance that I think was missing from the stereotype of what Tolkien dwarves are. Connor, Sarah, do you have any feelings on the dwarves and Elrond?
I agree with the whole thing of the idea of the subverting the dwarves dug too greedily too deep and everything. I like that they changed that, because I'm a huge fan of any time you're able to skirt around some potential anti-Semitism, so that, I think that was a really good change for them to do. I think Elrond and Durin was probably one of the stronger relationships in the show. I wish they had more time devoted to them. I think I got really disappointed when they brought the Silmaril stuff into the mithril subplot, because I'd been really enjoying it up till that point.
All you gotta do, man, is have a battle on a mountaintop in a thunderstorm next to a tree. That's all you gotta do.
Check all the boxes.
Oh
man, that was one of the things where an example of one of the changes I made, where it's one of the changes they made in the show, where it's like, you've already got a Silmaril that's underground, and I get why you're doing it, because you want to tie in the Balrog to everything. You're reskinning it, but it's one of those things where it's like, you already got that. You already have an underground Silmaril. It was one of those changes where it's like, why do we need to do this? Who is this for? And so it was one of those things where it's like, I think that part irked me more, as because up to that point, Elrond and Durin, sort of that whole plot line had been one of the standout things in the show for me. And so to sort of get sideswiped by something like that took me off guard, because I was like, man, I've been really enjoying this, and now you're bringing this in, like, and but I think back on what was already said, like if there was some kind of like sideshow or something with just the two of them, I would definitely tune in for that, because I think that was one of the stronger elements of the show.
Yeah, I agree. Sarah?
Yeah, I really enjoyed the relationship that Elrond had with Durin and Disa. And that was, like everyone has been saying, like that was a standout for me. When they were on, like I was actively enjoying the show generally. I didn't like the subplot about the elves fading very much, because like that's the whole point of the elves as Tolkien wrote them, is that they are going to fade, and that's not something that Mithril is going to fix. So that really bothered me from like, I guess a quote unquote Tolkien purist standard. And maybe I hadn't realized how much of a purist I am for like Tolkien's works and adaptations until now. So I think I would have enjoyed that a lot more if I was coming into the show not really knowing anything about the lore and about like Tolkien's extended writings. So I didn't enjoy that plot line.
I think one of the things that really bugged me about the Silmaril thing is it's one of those things where it's like, I think that change sort of undercuts a lot of the thematic sort of stuff that Tolkien was exploring with the Silmarils. Like the whole purpose of the Silmarils in like the source material is generally supposed to be that like the whole point is that like they're fighting to get these things of just divine beauty, but the number of things, the just absolutely evil things they do to try and get them back means that they're unworthy of that power. And so the idea that it's unironically just a solution that's going to work feels more like something you'd get out of like a Brandon Sanderson book than anything from like Tolkien, you know? And it's just sort of like, that was sort of why it sort of left a bit of a bad taste in my mouth, because it felt like it ran against a lot of the stuff that Tolkien was interested in exploring with that concept.
Yeah, that's very fair. And speaking of the, you know, the annals of Tolkien's lore and things that don't exist, but they just had to bring them in, our dear Harfoots. I love the Hobbits. Like the Hobbits for me are so iconic, and I felt that the Harfoots were pretty shoehorned in. Like it was this very, like they looked at the original trilogy of movies and thought like, oh, we have to have these very grounded, like earthy people. You know, the very kind, sort of isolated folk that work as like a blank slate for a lot of people to gravitate toward as an introduction to the more complex nature of this world and the world building and the characters and all the different stuff that's going on. And for me, the Harfoots were kind of like, okay, I can see what you're doing. You need to have like your Hobbit precursors in here. You know, just throw some fucking moss in their hair and make them all dirty, and, you know, give them this sort of like nomadic type thing. It was a little bit interesting to see like how they might kind of play into it in terms of like what would later become the Hobbits. But to me, I just didn't feel invested. I don't usually gravitate towards younger characters, and so Nori and her friend for me were immediately just kind of like, oh, okay. And then obviously we have our mystery meteor man, or as Connor calls him, Baby Gandalf. And that was like the only thing that was keeping me invested in the Harfoot storyline. I didn't care about their nomadic traditions. I didn't really care that much about the characters or like the family or intergroup drama. It was like, what is going on with Baby Gandalf? Who is he exactly? Or what did they plan on doing with him? And for me, that was the only thing that was really pulling me along there, because I felt like there just wasn't a lot of stakes in that storyline for a really long time. It's like, okay, you guys are going to go pick apples, or you're like, we'll go pick blackberries or something. Oh, there's a wolf. Where's this wolf going to come in? You know, and then we got, oh, there's Magic Man, there's Baby Gandalf, and he comes and he just slams the ground like he's like in a Tekken fight or something like that, and just like shockwave, and the wolves get scared and run off. So there was just a lot of stuff going on there that I had a really hard time just caring about what was going on with the Harfoots, other than who's baby Gandalf? Are you actually Gandalf? Are you just a general like blue wizard? But then, Phenderson, do you want to give your take on the Harfoots and everything there?
Definitely non-hygienic. Definitely folks who could stand to understand the germ theory of disease or those kinds of things to help them out. But other than that, I didn't mind the Harfoots. I didn't mind the Harfoots, even though I know the whole thing that hobbits don't play a big role beforehand. But I didn't mind the Harfoots because, for one, I understand that the show is doing, I think, just as you said, it's trying to bring people back into this universe, people who are much more familiar with the books and with 3 whole movies called The Hobbits, right, in which hobbits play a huge role. And so I'm not surprised that in pitching this thing to get $1 billion from the Greenlighters, that you say, hey, I'm going to bring in something like the Hobbits, those things that people like, especially since we know that Hobbit-like creatures play their role, right? That, what's his name? Gollum, descends from
the river folk.
Hobbit-like creatures. And so I'm going to go back and do that again, especially since I'm going to have some wizard. I don't know if it's baby Gandalf yet. They haven't given us a name, and knowing how they like to head fake us, yes, that he says things about his, like, follow your nose like Gandalf does and others. He hangs out. I was interested. I was like, what if it's Saruman? And turns out before he was a jerk, that he's hanging around Hobbit type creatures. I'm not going to give it away yet. I'm still open that it could be anything right now in this recreated version of Tolkien's world. And so, I mean, with the Harfoots, they were not like my absolute favorite. I wasn't like, oh yeah, more Harfoots. But I also didn't mind them. I guess I was agnostic with them. And yeah, I think that they were, I don't think their role was more than to give people some figures who were outside of the rest of this Tolkien world where everybody's like almost a semi-ethereal elf. Or you have, mead drinking, swigging dwarves who live underground, who all have nice grungy haircuts. And then you have punk haircuts, as you can see. And then there are the humans with the nice swords. And you kind of needed somebody, which I think the Hobbits always play, like, we're outside of all of that. We are just the common folk, right? Like Tolkien wanted to be the common English garden who have nothing to do with the larger battles and all these things. And we're just some regular old, the most salt of the earth folks you can get, right? And I think that was their role. Whether they played it effectively or not, I think is discursive, and that depends on how much people are into that. But I think that was their role, and it's definitely tied to you calling him Meteor Man, right? I don't think they could have stood on the story with their own without that, because I think his arrival is why we keep going back to them. He's like in nearly every shot, or at least he's nearby, or he's being thought of. And I actually think when we saw the end of this, I do wonder in some ways if they are not going to play a lot bigger role. Just like no one in reading The Hobbit, if you didn't know that the Lord of the Rings were coming, him just finding a ring. Oh, that's interesting. The Hobbit just found a ring. I don't know if that's going to play a point later on. Oh, yeah, it turns out it's the whole thing. The big thing.
Well, and I mean, Tolkien didn't know that it was going to play a part later on either.
Yeah.
You're like the central turning point of this entire thing, and that Galadriel and them, that's kind of the backstory, but you have to pay attention to these two. So I'm interested in seeing where they're going with this recreated, since they've decided to create these new creatures and everything. I'm interested to see where they're going with it. And, they're not Jar Jar Binks.
That's true.
I know for some people, they're going to be full Jar Jar Binks. I knew when I first saw it, I said, you're going to like the Harfoots, or going to hate the Harfoots. And I'm kind of agnostic. I'm not like, oh, Harfoots, but I'm just like
Harfoot ambivalent.
I'm willing to go along. Tell me more.
It's true. It's not
especially now that we've left them, and it's going to be Nori out in the big world.
That's true.
That's going to be an interesting thing. Yeah.
That for me was the saving grace.
I'm going on a journey. She's following in the footsteps of many hobbits to come, right?
She's
that
the
one
OG.
who decides to break tradition and head out into the world.
Yeah, she's the OG Bilbo and Frodo. Yeah. Connor, what's your take on the Harfoots?
I was surprised to find that I think the Harfoots were one of my favorite arcs, actually, which I was not expecting that because I mean, especially given everything I've been talking about with changes that they made, like this one is probably arguably the thing they changed the most. But I thought I never thought that I would be as into the idea of like, what if E.T. was in Middle Earth, like as I was. Like I thought it was really cool. I really thought it worked. I think it partially because I think it encapsulated the kind of thing I would have wanted from a show like this, which is like something with a much tighter focus that is still influenced by like these are past events and you kind of can see how they're going to connect. They might be able to connect up with stuff that goes on in the future. But I really there were some episodes where it was like, especially episode 7 where I kept checking my watch and everything, like, all right, okay, can we speed this up? Like there were parts like where the pacing stalled out and everything, but for the most part that was honestly one of my sort of favorite moments. I think maybe because I think it hit a tipping point where it changed. It was like so disconnected from the source material that I didn't have much of a foothold to compare it to like really anything else. And so I was a lot more willing to forgive a lot of the stuff that wasn't really as in line as opposed to like the other stuff where it was sort of trying to have it both ways. This was just sort of its own sort of thing. And so it was a lot easier to sort of roll with it. And I'd never really hit an unexpected snag because I was never really expecting it to really cling tightly to anything that had come before. I really, really liked this part. This was the one I had probably the least complaints about, actually.
Fascinating. Well, Sarah, what about you?
I'm kind of with Connor on this. Like, I thought that the Harfoots, I mean, yes, they were slow at times, but I thought that their story stood on its own more for me. And like, I thought that the writing was best when they were able to write something completely new, and they weren't trying to write along Tolkien's lines. I did have a couple of issues, like for a group that professes, or a culture that professes to care so much for like not leaving people behind, they talk an awful lot about like just coldly leaving people behind and like abandoning them and taking their wheels from their caravans.
Broke your wheel, just go off, you little, just like
and so like that I was like, okay, why? There's a disconnect between what you say and what you do here. And I did find the bit with the Meteor Man, like that was interesting. I'm pretty convinced that it's going to be baby Gandalf, because I don't think that the show has been all that great at doing like big fake outs. And like Gandalf has this relationship with the hobbits. So it would make sense if like the Harfoots were there when he first, came to Middle Earth, and that's why he feels so strongly for them.
Plus they're turning the people into moths at the end, like that whole thing.
Yeah, like that, and all of the
lines, like the little callbacks, like the toucan sound, follow your nose, and
not all the wonder I lost, that whole thing.
Exactly.
Yeah, like I'm pretty convinced that that's going to be Gandalf. But overall, I think I had fewer complaints about the scenes with the Harfoots.
I thought the cult of Melkor, cult of Sauron, whatever they are, like
that was okay. That was weird.
No, I had no idea what that was about.
I thought that was telegraphed very poorly. Like it was initially like an interesting mystery, but they didn't really play it out in a way that like, who are these people?
Yeah,
why are they looking for you? Yeah.
Like they didn't give enough information about them for me to care.
Exactly.
Literally.
Yeah.
Like I was just like, okay, you were 3 people who are really weird and think that this wizard is Sauron, but like I don't understand why you care about it. I don't understand what your motivations are. Like what are you doing here? What do you add to this scene?
Yeah.
You could just see the part where the writers were just sort of like, they got to like the third act, they're like, fuck, we don't have a climax. All right, cool. Let's grab some guys from 3 extras or something, just throw them in white robes and call it a day. Like,
Yeah,
there was nothing really there.
I saw online that someone referred to, there's like the one sort of like main
there's the
cultist.
nomad, the ascetic, and the dweller or something.
Yeah, but that one of them, it looks like Middle Earth Eminem. I was like, that's actually
Yes.
like
Yeah, I remember that. I think I texted Sarah at one point when watching it. I was like, "What is Eminem doing in this fantasy show?"
Slim Shady's up in here, up in Middle Earth. Phenderson, what did you think about these like weird cultists that were looking for Meteor Man?
Yeah, I mean, they were an interesting addition. I think there was so many interesting parts about them. I think because I know that there's going to be more, I'm kind of open to, like, obviously they or people like them are going to play roles coming up. They seem to be, I guess, what I'm thinking is there's some kind of worshippers of Melkor, so maybe leftovers because they're looking for Sauron. So I figure they must be some kind of worshippers of Melkor or the like, and they can do magic. I thought it was interesting, like when they're finally destroyed, they kind of look almost like ring wraiths for a second.
Yeah.
They become a moth. And I remember Gandalf talking to them. So I don't know what they're playing with there, right? And what happens to them. But I think obviously, in fact, have y'all decided he's baby Gandalf?
Yeah, for me, it feels
like convinced that he's baby Gandalf.
Interesting that they're heading off to, where is it they're going? They're going to a place that's known for magic. Is it, I can't think of the name right now. When they
Rune and Harad.
Yeah, and so they're heading off. And so it's interesting if these characters, I can't tell if they are Melkor worshippers or if they're other magic youth. I can't tell what it is they are. I mean, they can obviously do magic, and they're not really good because they burn up people's food stores and everything.
Yeah.
And they got defeated by
Harfoots guys. But I think the fact that I think after they show up, he's actually able to come into himself and kind of remember a bit of himself. I think that was obviously one of the plot devices, I think, there. And like they're the shock in getting him, and you finally get to see him. Okay, I finally, and also to play with our heads and like, could he be Sauron? And they have them, like Lord Sauron, we found you. I think it was awesome to throw people off, but I'm figuring that whoever they are, there must be more of them. And the fact that he's going off to figure out where they came from or what have you, tells me that they're going to play they and whoever they are, where they came from, and their role is going to play some larger thing. I think they're just some Melkor fanboys myself.
I kind of wonder if they're like part of that cult that the 2 blue wizards or something like created, like way off. I think in like Rune and Harad and everything.
Right.
I could see them doing something like that.
Yeah, and now that it's gonna be interesting because it's like baby Gandalf and Nori are gonna go towards Rune, but I think that's like a little bit like southeast of Mordor.
Yeah.
So, now that Mordor is the way it is, we could talk about the Southlands and
New Mordor.
New Mordor. And our characters, we got Arondir and Bronwyn and all these dirty ass villagers. And then we've got Adar and the Orcs. And Phenderson, you brought up the Orcs earlier. I thought Arondir was interesting. There was someone that made a comment online that I thought was really funny. It's like, he's the elf. He's got his love interest of Bronwyn, but they just talk really close to each other's faces. It's like, can you give each other a little bit of... Nobody talks like that. They're just like, I think I want you. It's like, get out of her face, man. Maybe she'll kiss you. Maybe she'd kiss you earlier if you just gave her some distance. But I like that. Arondir had like an interesting sort of relationship between like the villagers. There was a lot of tension there in terms of like the former soldiers and the former followers of Melkor and this kind of stuff that was hidden in. Hated Theo, just like you, Phenderson. Is like, Theo was so annoying. I'm like, get a haircut, dude. You look like you're out of like a medieval like cliche. And overall, like the way that story progressed was like the orcs and the mystery behind the orcs was the thing that was keeping me invested. The romance between Arondir and Bronwyn was like, whatever. But the orcs, I love that they have more, just like that they feel more powerful. Phenderson, you brought up earlier, where it's like they just felt like, falling ducks in a lot of the like earlier representations. But here it's like, no, they're really a force of nature and an individual.
They also have a purpose.
Yeah, they're really brutal.
They want to find a homeland. They've been like left out in the dark, and they're like, we need a place to live.
Yeah, they're like, we're gonna live in these like tunnels and like animal skulls and stuff like that. The costume design and like the way that the orcs were done is like hands down for me the best representation of orcs, Tolkien orcs that I've ever seen. Like I loved the orcs in the Lord of the Rings trilogy, but this is like, wow, that's fantastic and really cool the way that they feel a bit more like barbaric with the way that they're dressed and everything like that. And the fact that they're, you know, legitimately fearful of the sun and that whole thing. And then I love the way that Adar comes in as their leader. And, you know, again, you have this bit of like a Sauron fake out. It's like, is he Sauron? Is he not? Who's the father of the orcs and everything like that? But then, you know, there's a cool history there with Adar in terms of his actual distaste for what Sauron was trying to accomplish and what he feels like he's trying to do, which is like, I just want to build a home for my family, you know? And it's like, oh, that's sweet. You know, even though they're like these vicious orcs, I thought that whole storyline was really cool. And they felt like a good threat in a show that was quite sorely lacking a lot of powerful villainous figures. Sarah, do you want to get in on the Southlands? And you can even give Lily a shout out and shit on Bronwyn's clothing.
On behalf of my co-host, I do have to complain about the fact that Bronwyn's dress was indigo. Like, where are they getting indigo? That really bothered Lily when we watched the first couple of episodes.
She's so clean, and everyone else is covered in like cow poo, and she's like,
I mean, she is a healer. She is a healer, so like that didn't bother me quite as much.
I think she would have shared some of like her germ theories and everything with the rest of the villagers by now.
Yeah,
I mean, they didn't seem to listen to her all that much before.
That's true. There is that. Yeah.
Before the main events, but
oh, guys, I promise. Just take a shower every now and then. It'll be great.
For me, I think what bothered me most about her costume was not the indigo, but like the tank top like aspect of it. That just threw me out. I was like, this is weirdly modern looking. But complaints about costuming aside, I did like the orcs. I liked how they got a little more depth to them than what Tolkien wrote to them, because Tolkien's orcs are incredibly one-dimensional and not that great, honestly. But so that was good. The plot of the Southlands in general, I just didn't like. It didn't grip me really. I didn't care about any of them particularly. I didn't feel moved by Bronwyn and Arondir's romance because like they've had a handful of conversations and he stared longingly at her, and that does not make you two in love. I'm sorry. But so that like I didn't care about that, and I didn't feel that much urgency in what was happening. And so yeah, it was not my favorite part of the show. But it wasn't like offensive or anything. I mean, it just wasn't for me.
Yeah, that's totally fair. It's like the urgency, like the one until the orc showed up and there was like the, you know, the slave camp chain gang kind of thing going on. That was when it was like, okay, there's actually like some real threat here, you know? Even if the fight against the orcs with the chains was a bit ridiculous. Is like
I just couldn't get over how bad the CGI wargs were.
I love the CGI
warg.
Oh, I loved that. It was horrible, and I loved it.
It's like you look like
horrible, and I hated it.
You look like a cracked out chihuahua. Like, what is going on here? Connor, what's your take on the Southlands?
On paper, I feel like it should have been my favorite, but it felt like the plot line that had the least amount of time devoted to it. So it was really like every time I was starting to be like, oh, this is really cool, it would cut away and be like, come on, wait, what? I will say I think a lot of the most tense sort of set pieces were in that plot line, like the bit where the orc first shows up with Theo and like Bronwyn and everything, and just the lengths they have to go just to murder one of them. That was probably one of my favorite scenes on the first episode, because that was like one of the like I hadn't been having a great time in that episode, and then that happened. And all of a sudden, I just sort of sat up and started paying attention a lot more. I really like the orcs being more like tougher to kill and tougher to fight, and everything that's going on in that plot line. It's one of those things where it's like, I wish more attention was given to it, because on paper these are really cool ideas, but it didn't seem like there was a lot of time devoted to it. So it made it feel like the show itself was just kind of disinterested in it, just because they had so many plot lines, and I feel like they could have trimmed either one of the plot lines out or trimmed one of the other things down. Like you were talking about the Harfoots, like you don't need that many scenes with the Harfoots. You could have taken a few of them out to give them more time here, because.
But they have to have a singing montage as they caravan across time.
That's it. If they didn't have the singing montage, they would have had all the time that I would have been hooked.
I would have had no concept of their movements. It's like
it was just the battle in episode 6 was one of the things where it was just sort of like, I really, really wanted to like it a lot more than I did, but there was a lot of the time it was just sort of like, it was the stakes felt very disconnected. It was just sort of like, what are they fighting for? What lessons do these characters need to learn in order to win? What happens if they lose? And like, I think a lot of this is a general sort of pet peeve with larger sort of writing issues I have with SFF sort of stuff, where people will hold back for a reveal. But because they're holding back for a reveal, that makes it that much more difficult to set up stakes or to get invested, because they're like, oh, this reveal is going to be so cool. But in the meantime, I have no clue what's going on. So I can't fucking like follow any of it. Or I mean, you can follow it, but it's a lot harder to sort of get invested because you don't know the totality of the stakes.
Exactly.
I really like the bit with Elrond just sort of infiltrating the orc camp with like the fire arrow that takes out part of the tower. That was probably my favorite sequence of that, because it just felt like just fully.
Why can one arrow break a rope that's holding up this tower? Why is this tower being held up by
it's badass? I'll forgive it. Like it's like I've shit on this show so much. That's one of the things where it's like, it's cool enough that I can give you a pass. It was just straight Errol Flynn. It was just like just sort of suave, charming, just going in there.
Why is this tower so shoddily built?
Yeah,
because they're orcs.
It took me. It shouldn't, but it wasn't the orcs that built it.
No, it was the elves.
Oh no, it wasn't.
Yeah,
it
was the elves.
Well, that's like on my face.
Yeah,
maybe the orcs come in and they made it worse or something. There are no orc engineers. There's no orc like I have a PhD in engineering, so maybe they just didn't know how to upkeep the whole thing.
Or maybe a Rondir just went around with a knife and just loosened all of the mortar. just like loosen that shit out.
Got in there with the chisel, just like pounded away.
I just that scene in particular took me out of that battle so fast. I was like, what is this?
He was like very superhuman in there.
I really like
and stuff.
That scene was like, it was cool enough that I was able to forgive a lot of the gripes I would have otherwise had. Although when the battle itself got going, it felt weird when like he's getting into it with just this one orc. I really like the fight, but then he just comes out from an alleyway and the battle's just mostly over or something. Like they just took care of the rest of it. Like, wait a minute, if he was having such a hard time with that one guy, how did all these random villagers take out like just a whole arc?
But actually, I like that because we learned that they were killing other humans.
Yeah.
Fuck.
They like lift up the mask and it's like, oh shit, I know that guy.
I thought it was only a partial, like some of them were there. I thought like
no, I think
it was like half and half.
I think most of them were people or were human.
Okay. I thought it was more of a 50-50 kind of deal. That makes more sense then. Wow.
Phenderson, do you wanna give your takes on the Southlanders, but also
I gotta say I didn't have a big deal with that arrow taking down the thing, because I watched
I like the
giant elephant once with people on it, and everybody thought it clapped in the theater. That was the coolest thing ever. And I was like, yeah, I know elves are magical, but come on. He literally slides down a ton.
Surfboards down it, yeah.
That's like elven gravity.
Hey, they're elves. That's what I figure. Like, we put elves overhead. They can do stuff. So yeah, you know what I liked about the Southlands, for Tolkien, infamously, everything to do with the South was just the swarthy people from the South who were just, who didn't find the light of the great light of the Valar or whatever, and it was just just unfortunately very antisocial. To put it lightly. So it was interesting to see what I liked about this, about what I thought they did good about the idea of the Southlands. I like the notion, I think somebody brought up, that they used to be Melkor worshippers, right? And now they're pretty much occupied, right? they're like West Germans or something. They're like, yeah, we don't trust you guys. You guys got to get occupied now. And we're the elves. And it's been generations. And there's this like belief, I think that Tolkien has a lot. It's like blood thing, It's like, well, if your ancestors are this way, then somehow it's in your soul and your blood that you're just naturally going to be Melkor worshippers or prone to it, right? In some ways. And you can see some, like, there's that young guy who stands up, like they call him, what is it, knife ears? Like, you have a slur for him. Interesting. And they're like, hey, we're tired. Like, it was our ancestors. We're not into this stuff. We're different. But it turns out some of you totally are. So
it's like, you've been hiding that sword.
Part of it is that they're mistreated, right? That they are, there's this notion of like, we can't get away from what our ancestors did. Like, and I think part of this may have to do with, I'm an elf. To me, ancestors, I was there. I was there at the war. You guys are just kind of all the same. I've just been living my elf life.
And, to me.
What's the difference between you and your grandparents? We saw as Elrond, he can't even keep up with dwarves, and they have longer lifespans. So I can imagine. So there's a dichotomy of how I think it was interesting how the elves are like this occupying force that's trying to like keep these folks, but at the same time they're oppressing them and they're never allowing them to get beyond what they did before. So I thought that was an interesting quality to play with. And I think the whole setting up of the Southlands, of course, it plays into the Sauron thing, of course, and starts to see Mordor created. I thought that was the best part, was the volcano exploding was like the best part of the Southlands. The introduction of the orcs was good. But yeah, the Southlands, like I too, like the battle was interesting, and I could tell they were trying to make it Helm's Deepish, but it was like, I called it like mini Helm's Deep. It just couldn't, it couldn't qualify it, even though I understood the stakes was that the orcs might eat you. Yeah. Right? I don't know if these orcs are, I think from what we know about orcs, they're not too picky on sentient beings and eating. Yeah. So they don't want the orcs taking over. And so it seemed that this was one of the reasons. But I think if anything, the problem that happened here, I think, with them is that both my wife called them Elf Bay. Both Elf Bay and everybody kind of like disappeared after everything kind of happened. Like the last, it was like, they're just like the purpose, and Arondir, his entire purpose gets kind of lost, and I'm hoping they rediscover it because it seemed like he was a big part of it. Then he kind of filters out somewhere along the end. I think there's kind of a way where if you have all these various threads, you want in your final episode, like wrap everything kind of together and make sure that everybody's getting these equal parts. And I thought that was a little lost. But yeah, I think what's interesting about the Southlands, maybe we got so much of it because it's just not there anymore. It's over. It's Mordor now.
Yeah, I mean,
right?
they even
There's
have
no more Southlands.
The cheesiest part for me is like I loved like the Mount Doom, the creation of Mount Doom, and the way that everything like
and on the map.
And then no, it's just like a title up in the Southlands burns away and becomes
there's no more
Mordor.
Southlands. It's gone. And so all I can say is the Southlands, we hardly knew ye. It's Mordor now. It's all Mordor.
But I thought it's like visually it was telegraphed. You didn't have to put a fucking title and change it on the screen. Like that was
everybody likes this is fantasy. Are you going against the fantasy map? Do I need to call the fantasy police here?
I just remembered.
Go for it, Connor.
This is neither positive nor negative. It's just something that every time they had those little map transitions, I just was expecting the Indiana Jones theme to come on in every time. It was just, every single time. Where'd it go? Where is it? Come on, like this. It was so corny. It's like I neither positive nor negative. Every time I was waiting for that to come on in.
Yeah.
And by the way, I thought they were just all, and again, because these movies trying to pull from, I really thought they were just pulling from Jackson. One by one, the free lands, you get to see the burning. Yeah. I really, every time I saw them, that's what I thought with the Morder thing. I was like, here's our ode to Peter Jackson. Like, we'll get to hear a little music from the thing. They're trying to get that continuity going.
Yeah. But speaking of those big reveals, let's talk about Sauron. I saw this meme online where it's like,
wait a minute, no Balrog? We don't get to talk about the Balrog?
We can talk about the Balrog too.
The Balrog in the basement.
We'll talk about Sauron, and then we'll get to the Balrog in the basement. I saw this meme online that is like they should have done with the Southlands to Morder. They should have done that with Halbrand on screen, just a title that fades away and becomes Sauron. It's so fucking obvious. What did y'all think of like Galadriel and Halbrand riding off to Lindon, reuniting with Elrond, and then Celebrimbor and his forging of the 3 elven rings, and his apparent not knowing about what the hell alloys are, and Halbrand just being like, "Hey man, you get 2 metals to like fuck, and they have a really good time, and then they become really powerful rings. Like, why don't you do that?" He's like, "I never thought about that before." To me, it was so cheesy. Like, come on.
Oh
dude.
man.
Who has thoughts on the forging of the rings and the revealing of Sauron?
I do.
Go, Connor.
Oh, I was already not the biggest fan of this show, and then all that happened. There was a moment. There's a moment when right after the alloy thing, where there are 2 moments where I screamed "fuck you" at my screen. One of them was when Halbrand Celebrimbor was like, "This is a very interesting observation," and Halbrand was like, "Call it a gift," and I was like, "Ah, come on, you haven't earned the Anatar reference." The people who will get that are probably not that Venn diagram. People who get the Anatar reference and people who are a big fan of what's going on here is going to be just like vanishingly slim. I just it's just that whole reveal again. It ties back into the thing where it retroactively makes Galadriel look incompetent, and then there's the whole idea of like, why did he save her out on the ocean? Everything, if Sauron and everything, and it was one of the things that landed with the biggest thud for me. Like, even just the fact that like there's the one thing where Sauron says she can be stronger than the foundations of the earth. And it's like, come on. Like, that was the other point where I said, "fuck you" at my screen, where it's just sort of like, she had to get that line from a man? Really? Really? You had to let someone else give that one to her? Like, just let her have her badass speech. Come on.
Yeah. Let her figure out what she feels like corruption should be for her.
Let her find her own metaphors.
Exactly. Sarah, what about you? What were your thoughts on the Sorry, just quick comment on the actual visuals of them forging the rings. Really cool.
Those
was very, very
I can
beautiful.
give them props. They had good. This show has good visuals. I will
even though Celebrimbor's just a bit of a dunce, but Sarah, go.
I mean, and I also felt that the rings would look a lot prettier if they actually cut the jewels properly. But that's.
I don't think they cut. Did they cut them for the Jackson movies?
I don't know, but I think that those rings would have looked better cut too. So at least I'm consistent. Halbrand confused me. Like, I knew that he was going to be Sauron. Like, I called that by like episode 4. But the way that he was so invested in like this human Halbrand persona, it felt off to me with what we knew about Sauron in the show thus far. And so I would have liked them to go into that a little more. Like, it just felt like, why is he, so invested in pretending that he's this human? Like, why
just leave me on Númenor so I can just like be a smithy,
Yeah, I just didn't. I wanted either more from that or less. So I found that a little frustrating. And then it felt honestly like the showrunners just wanted to write Galadriel Sauron fan fiction a lot of the time.
Yeah.
Which
are they going to kiss?
It works kind of in the sense that
$1 AO3 project.
Yeah, like it does give Galadriel's temptation like depth to it, but it didn't work for me personally as a viewer. But this show was, I mean, not for me in general. So like that it is what it is. So I had some frustrations about that. And yeah, I would have liked if like Halbrand hadn't had to mansplain alloys to Celebrimbor, but
you know, Phenderson, you brought up this point of like adding depth to her temptation earlier, but what were your thoughts on the reveal of Sauron, how that all came together?
Yeah, I mean, I thought two things. I thought it was either Halbrand, or I thought, oh, they really wanted to make it's Halbrand and the guy who falls from the sky, right? Somehow he's been split or whatever, and put him back together. Yep. Let's take it back to some,
second coming of
Dark
Melkor.
Crystal, baby. Yeah, let's just do it. Let's make them two things. I was like, it's one or both. It's that's how I'm playing it.
Yeah.
No, I thought it was interesting when I figured out early on too. I was like, okay, it's definitely this guy is, and he really lays it on thick. He becomes the Lord of Gifts completely in that last one. Hey, how about you ever thought about making some ring? He's like doing. I was like, okay, I get it. You're Sauron. That whole thing was a fake reveal with the three Melkor worshippers. You're actually the guy. It's really interesting that. For one thing, I'm not too upset about Galadriel being tricked because Sauron is a deceiver. It's what he does. He is the ultimate Sith Lord, right? That's what he's like, yeah, look me up. That's what I do. I deceive everybody. I'm still in the deceiving business. That's my job. I deceive you. I don't care who you are. I'm the deceiver, right? And so I'm not surprised that he can deceive everyone. I'm curious, however, if he is. While certainly he's this deceptive person, if Halbrand is, I don't know if they're also complicating Sauron, right? If they're making him this figure that, because he says here, look, he gives a reason, just like we got a reason the dwarves don't drink too greedily or too deep. He has a reason like, look, it was chaotic before. Melkor was kind of out of control. I want to bring some order here, right? This is what I want to do.
But like Galactic Empire level order.
Yeah, like if you read like Dr. Doom sometimes has this, sometimes, right? Yeah. I'm trying to want peace in the world, right? Everything's chaotic. I want peace, right? That's what I want to do. It just so happens I want my iron will is the one to do it. And I think it's interesting because our histories before, right, are like the Elves' history or so forth. Now we're getting to like, hey, maybe Sauron has a story to tell. It turns out, right? And his story is he's still a terrible person. I thought that was interesting in that last temptation part when he gets this reveal. That there are moments in there when you think of him forging where we get to see Halbrand's face, where I'm wondering, does he actually want to do this as much as he wants to, right? Does Galadriel end up in an ironic way pulling him to do this thing where at some points he's like, maybe I just want to walk away. Maybe I don't want to do all of this stuff. And Galadriel has now kind of pulled him into this, right? So I can't tell if it's that he was deceiving all along or if she somehow played a role as well in pulling him back into this. And now this is, he's going to do this thing. Because this is part here where he's tempting her at the end, where he's trying to sound all nice. And then you realize like, oh no, you're really a bad guy. When she says no, and he was like, oh, you're really abusive. You're being kind of abusive here, my dude. Like starts doing the yelling and things. It's like, no, I'm still the guy who thinks I can fix things. And it's almost as Sauron is coming off as a guy who thinks he's doing well after all. He's not just, no, I'm dedicated to evil. I'm team evil. It's like, no, I think I'm doing the right thing because I'm the only one who can do it. And my way is the best way. And I am in the end doing something good, right? And you guys just will realize it once you fall under my iron grip, right? I will create peace. I'll make everyone feel better. I'll take away all your pain and all your problems. Right. And then kind of
equation,
I don't know if that's what they're trying to do, complicated, but I'm interested to see what's going to happen now that he's heading into Mordor, because as I understand it, Mordor ain't his. This is
Addar's,
right? Who we find out, quote unquote, killed him. I want to know, what does that mean that you killed Sauron? You created Mordor. Like Sauron has to show up and take this. So what's going to happen now? Is this going to be a battle between him and Ardar? How is he going to deceive Ardar the same way? Is he going to have to fight? Is he now going to take up his mantle? It's like, yep, that's who I am. I'm the Dark Lord.
I'm going to go get some really spiky armor.
Yeah, maybe recruit some Balrogs.
Yeah, because they seem to be trying to complicate again his narrative. Whether that works or not, I'm going to see where they're taking this. But this obviously, hey, if somebody said this isn't your daddy's Sauron. That's all I can.
Yeah.
I like that.
It's emo Sauron, it turns out.
Just leave me on Númenor, man. Just go away. Yeah, it was like Galadriel just pulled him along.
Trying to subjugate all of humanity again.
Oh, just I just expected to have that.
Melkor, but I guess now
you're making my rings.
Yeah, don't compare me to Melkor. Come on. And what about the Balrogs? Sarah, did you have any? Or the Balrog singular? Did you have any thoughts on? First of all, that is like the most. I don't know, just like farthest flowing leaf I've ever seen in my life, where it's just like, oh, you think I'm going to stop? You think, no, I'm going to keep going through the tunnels of Moria. And then, oh, boom, there's a Balrog. Oh, shit.
Like the feather from Forrest Gump.
Exactly. Yes, exactly. Yeah. Sarah, what were your thoughts on the Balrog?
I mean, so like I said, I wasn't a huge fan of the Mithril coming from the Silmaril tree being what is necessary to save the elves. Like I didn't enjoy that, but the visuals of the Balrog were really pretty, and I like bringing the Balrog in, or the threat of the Balrog in, to hint at what is going to happen to the dwarves in Khazad-dûm.
Y'all are gonna get with fire.
And the Balrog, I mean, like the Balrog looked awesome. Yeah. Like the Balrog looked really cool.
Yeah. Very, very reminiscent. It was just like an updated version of the one in the Peter Jackson films. It felt like a natural progression of that. Connor, what about you? What did you think of the Balrog?
I will echo Sarah's points with like the discontent with the Silmithril or whatever the fuck, combining those two. It did look pretty good, and I'm sort of wondering if everything with Adar and Sauron is going to somehow, because there were orcs down in Moria and everything by the time the Fellowship gets there. So I'm wondering if maybe
goblins, I think,
like, so I think at that point, like, I'm wondering if maybe like Adar or Sauron are gonna like figure out there's a Balrog there and try and see if they can do some recruitment or something like that.
Yeah, it's going to be like Ocean's 11 across Middle-earth. Like, let's go get a Balrog here, some cave trolls there, some Haradrim. Let's go figure this shit out. Fenderson, what about you? Thoughts on the Balrog?
Yeah, they can get that Balrog out of Moria to do some fighting. I will be very good. Yes. I'm extremely happy to see that. In the battle on the slopes. Because I'm figuring this is all going to end for us on the slopes of Mount Doom, right? This is where we're all headed. We're headed to the big thing. We got to even see Isildur, who that's a whole other thing. But yeah, I mean, all I can say, I mean, we all knew the Balrog thing everyone knew, and so we were kind of waiting for it. So I'm glad they held it in reserve, because I wanted to keep seeing it. It turns out it's the king who wakes up the Balrog. How ironic that you have done the very thing you were trying not to do. Well, he doesn't know this, but he. I wondered if he did. Like, he's so much against this. I wonder if he knows, like, there's some lore, there might be a Balrog down there. I don't want to freak anybody out. I don't want to cause panic in the Dwarflands, but because he's so against this, I sometimes wondered if he knew that we could wake something up down there, especially since this is Tolkien's world, so people can have feelings and ideas and sensations that there's some darkness or the shadow is down there, right? Or something like that, the enemy somehow. I will say I had no idea that was a very long falling leaf. I don't know what wind it was going along, as it was going down. I had no idea Balrog was just light sleepers, because I assumed the Balrog would sleep. Touches him and dude wakes up in a bad mood immediately.
I was about to say, it's like, if a leaf falls in a mine, is there a Balrog around to hear it? It's just like
he woke up pissed.
Shit. Yeah.
I mean, he didn't just stir in his sleep like, I just assumed he was asleep, unless they're saying he was just awake the whole time down there, which is, I guess I'd be pissed too if I was just sitting around in the dark the whole time down in a mine, and it was just like, I'm just down here by myself. The last known Balrog.
Was it the same leaf that was healed by the Mithril thing? So I figured that was what woke it up. Was there like it was just like, oh, I smell the light of the Balrog. Okay,
maybe so. It might be it. And now, like, I'm pissed. Give me a dragon to ride on, and let's do this thing.
Yeah. Oh man, I love that. And
he still thinks the war is going on, by the way. He doesn't know. He shows up like
Captain America.
What?
Where is everybody? Yeah. These fucking like hairy Harfoots.
Like, how long has it been?
Exactly. He's like a Rip Van Winkle Balrog. Are you telling me all that time has passed?
Oh man, but I love that it's setting up something really epic for the dwarves' future. And just to close out, I wanted to get all your final thoughts on the season, but also what you hope to see in the future. Season 2. I imagine Amazon's not going to back down. They're going to be like, yeah, we're going through to the end.
Well, they can't. They've committed to 5 seasons.
Yeah. So what are you, Sarah? Do you want to start? What are your final thoughts, and what do you want to see?
Final thoughts. I really didn't enjoy the show. Unfortunately, I wanted to like it and I just didn't, which is fine. I mean, some things are just not for everyone.
Yeah.
And that doesn't take away from the people who did enjoy them. Like, I probably will still watch season 2, just because I am a glutton for punishment and it is Tolkien.
Yeah.
I would like to see a little more internal consistency in characters, and I would like to feel like there's been a little more thought gone into some of the decisions that they make and that they write into the show. Other than that, yeah, I mean, I want to continue to see the really pretty visuals. Like, it's a gorgeous show. For all of my complaints about it, like it's just visually, it's very stunning, and very well done in general. So I'd like to see them continue with that high standard that they started out with.
But just like up the quality of like character development and story.
Yeah, just improve everything else. But.
And Connor, what about you?
Similar to Sarah, I didn't have a great time on most of it. There were a couple of standout sequences. I think I at least got something out of it from a perspective of like examining why I didn't like it and what didn't work for me. Just sort of was a bit of a lesson. Just sort of like, even just what can I take away from this for whatever I want to write in the future, kind of a thing.
Yeah.
But on the whole, it just, I found it was like it had way too much going on without much of a central pull of a narrative that's like to shape everything around. So it ended up making the whole thing feel unfocused and at times like just a bit boring for me.
Yeah.
With a couple of good hits in there. And honestly, even if I didn't like it, I don't know if I'm going to check out season 2, but I probably will see at least a few episodes, if only because I think like examining why I don't like it is probably going to be at least an interesting time.
Mm-hmm.
And I kind of like, given how different it is, I have a morbid curiosity about where they're going with it, I think.
Yeah, I'm on the same page as you in terms of like, yeah, there was lacking the central pull. There were a lot of times where I was just kind of like, okay, this is too meandering, or it's like the slow burn that Phenderson was mentioning was just a bit too slow for me in certain respects. Whereas like there are some storylines where there's a really good thrust to it, but other storylines where it's just like, okay, this is like lingering a bit too long, or I don't really care what's going on here. But in terms of future seasons, it's like, yeah, I want to see story and editing and pacing that match like the visual splendor of the show. Cause yeah, like I said earlier, it's like, it's a lot of style, but not as much substance. And I feel like they could, with the ground that they're working on, could up the quality of that substance to meet the style.
Yeah.
And
I want to see some, oh, sorry.
No, go for it, Connor.
Just the other thing was I just wanted to see a bit more clearer character work, because it seems like there were at least some attempts at character work, but like I think a lot of the again with the style over substance approach to it, I think made a lot of the decisions muddle the sort of text of the narrative, so it was difficult to sort of always understand why various decisions were being made or what the thought process was for various characters to get to wherever they're going.
Mm-hmm, exactly. And Phenderson, what about you?
Yeah, prequels are hard.
Yeah.
We have seen in the world of science fiction, prequels are just difficult. And, I think about Peter Jackson doing The Lord of the Rings, and he pretty much, I mean, I'm not saying it wasn't, of course, difficult to do a creative, but literally the story's just there.
Yeah.
Right? The whole story, you got it. You got the whole story, you got the line, you got just everything's kind of there. And I think in creating this, it was probably both freeing in the fact that they could take such license with the literature because it's just not all written out the same way. At the same time, they have to make all of these choices that are going to be good, bad, and it's going to be experimental. It's just to me, it's just such a different beast than doing like the Lord of the Rings was, right? Not only because one, the source material, but also because we all know it's going to come. It's one thing that makes prequels so odd because we know it's coming, right? You can't really surprise us too much. We know everything that's going to happen, and we know where this is all going to lead. And so prequels are always difficult this way. I think this was an admirable first step in trying to do something like this, especially like since they're going to stretch it out over 5 seasons. I think it's very ambitious to try to take this on. And, I think, as what Connor said in the beginning, this is a really ambitious thing that they're trying. Yeah. I think this is an admirable first step. I think that they're going to have to follow through with a lot of things they started, especially the things that they've changed. I'm not a big deal about them changing things, even if, yes, you're bringing wizards long before they should be. Okay. Yeah. All I know, I always put it this way, as I guess this is a historian part of me, histories change when you find new information. Maybe some of those histories were wrong. I've got the real history. You guys didn't know it. I come from a comic book world. It's called the retcon. They do it constantly. Oh, yeah. Right? And so I don't really have a big deal with them changing these things, but I do think they need to answer. I think, as you guys said, they need to be consistent and they need to have some follow through, right? They have to, if you're going to make some big leaps and big changes, you better come up with some big answers, right? And give us some of that. So I think they're going to have to, they've laid it out. And, I got to think they've also had to get through all of these beginning parts to really start the story. We've got 3 rings made. Yes, those 3 rings are not supposed to have been made till the end so Sauron can corrupt them. So they made them first. Okay.
There are 17 more.
I said, I need to see where you're going with this. And I'm really interested in seeing how the dwarven wings are going to be made. Like, I want to see the ring rates come about. There's like a lot of good stuff that they can bring to us as we see the rings being made, as we see Anatar, the Lord of Gifts, go about doing his thing. How Sauron takes Mordor, how he's how things are going to basically, how he's going to build his basic empire, how the orcs are going to multiply. This is a lot here for them to do. Númenor falling into the sea. I can't even get it all down, much less before we come up to the battles. There's so much to be done. And so I think they have a lot of space to grow. And I'm hoping that they grow as a show as they go forward, right? I'm hoping that they get better with each season and make this a better show. I hope they do an opposite Game of Thrones. Right? We're like, this episode, I hope that they do the opposite. They start off with okay. And like, so I'm definitely going to be there. It's Tokens on TV, as I said, I grew up with. Yeah. I gotta, just for the respect of it, I gotta show up and do that. And I would say that at the very end, when they, like, I think showing the making of the 3 rings was just beautifully done. I loved seeing that. And then when it ends and Fiona Apple's voice comes in, oh yeah, the 3 rings, I had shivers. It was like the first time the show gave me chills. Like that was me again. I was in middle school reading that book. My lamplight should have been in bed, glued to it, hearing her 3 rings. I never heard it set the song for one. So hearing that took me, and I was like, yeah, I'm gonna be back. I'm gonna see you next season. Yeah. And so that's my thoughts on it. I think the show, I have faith that the writers hope they know what they're doing and that they can improve as time goes on.
Yeah, it was the same with Wheel of Time. It's like, take all these lessons and just apply it. But for me, it's like the Rings of Power, while it was not like an undoubtable success or anything like that, it was like, this is a solid foundation and you can make something really cool. You got 4 seasons left, just keep getting better. Yeah. And
notice I'm much less critical of this than I was.
That's true.
I had much to say, and I love the Wheel of Time books and everything. But yeah.
I'm the opposite. I was much less critical of Wheel of Time and much more critical of this.
You should see the Wheel of Time.
Oh, I'll link to that.
Stop it. Dark Parent, I want to see it.
Oh, fuck. Well,
anyway, I don't want to go into that. That's all I've been.
No, it's all good. But Phenderson, Sarah, and Connor, thank you so much for journeying across Middle Earth with me and talking about the Rings of Power. But if you could just let listeners and viewers know where they can find you on social media. Sarah, we'll start with you.
So you can find us. We're Fiction Fans Podcast. Our handle on Instagram and Twitter is @FictionFansPod. You can also email us fictionfanspod@gmail.com if you have any thoughts.
Yeah, and they also recently did an episode on Fenderson's Ring Shout, which I highly recommend.
We did.
Yeah. So go hit that up. And Phenderson, where can people find you?
I'm at Djèlí Clark. You can find me there on Twitter as well as Instagram. And let's see, my author site is also pjelyclark.com. So I'm very consistent. You can find me in all of those places.
Yeah, and you can go pick up Ring Shout, Master of Djinn, all your books.
One of them things.
Yeah.
One of those things.
Yeah, one of those things. Yeah. And Connor, what about you?
You can find me on Twitter at the CM Caplan. Same thing for Instagram, and I have The Sword in the Street that's currently available, and my new book, The Fall Is All There Is, it's out. It's in pre-order and will be available on November 7th.
Amazing, cool, and I'll link to all of that. So
Thank you.
don't you worry. But yeah, thank you all so much for taking the time today. It was really good to hear your thoughts on the Rings of Power, and shit it out a little bit. Give it some praise. It's what it's all about. So I really appreciate it.